Hello, Human Bio. This is Miss S, and this is your first time doing a podcast. The seniors are already doing podcasts because they don't have enough time to learn all the information, so they're getting pulled out of shop in order to listen to these. Since I'm not here today, you guys are going to be taking notes on notes number 8, filling them in just like we do in class, and then you guys are going to have a review sheet and a respiratory coloring packet, which is going to be to finish for homework. So let's get started with the notes. Okay, in these notes we're going to be talking about the respiratory system, so how we breathe. So the respiratory system has two main jobs. First, we have to be able to get in oxygen so that we can use that in our cells. Remember, we use oxygen for cellular respiration. Now, oxygen is what we want, but we need to get out carbon dioxide. That's a waste in our bodies, and we need to be able to get that out. So the respiratory system has two main jobs: to breathe in oxygen and to breathe out carbon dioxide. There are many parts that make up the respiratory system. These are not in order, but we're going to learn about the order that air goes through, starting from your nose all the way to the end of your lungs. So they are your nasal cavity, being your nose, your trachea, which is your windpipe. You can actually feel your trachea if you feel with your finger right here. It feels like these ridges. There's these rings of cartilage which are helping to hold your windpipe open, and that air is going to be pushed down to your lungs. The epiglottis we're going to talk about in a little bit, but it's basically a little flap that helps food not go down your windpipe so you don't choke. Your larynx is your voice box, and the way I always remember that is that LA, la 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 la, is what produces sound. So your larynx is your voice box. Your lungs are the main part of the respiratory system, and they're composed of smaller parts called the bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveoli, and finally, the diaphragm is the muscle right beneath your lungs that are going to help make either the lungs smaller or bigger, depending on whether you're breathing in or out. So we're going to take a look at each of these and look where they are. If at any point you fall behind, you can ask the sub to pause so you can copy down the notes. So here we have a diagram of the respiratory system. It begins in your nose or your mouth, depending which way you're breathing, and oxygen is going to go down your larynx, your voice box, down your trachea, your windpipe, and branch into your two lungs. When it branches into the two lungs, this part right here is called a bronchus or bronchi. Okay, they branch into the lungs. As soon as you're in the lungs, you can see that the branches get smaller and smaller. These smaller branches are known as bronchioles. At the end of the bronchioles are these little sacs. These are little air sacs, and these air sacs are called alveoli. If you were to zoom in on the alveoli, it would look like this. Alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. Remember, capillaries are tiny little blood vessels. So it's here in the alveoli where oxygen is actually getting into your blood and carbon dioxide is leaving your blood and going back into the lungs so that you can exhale it. Okay? And last but not least, the diaphragm, which you can see right here, is this muscle that's right underneath your lungs. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Most importantly is the alveoli, those tiny sacs, because this is where gas exchange happens. This is where oxygen gets into our blood and carbon dioxide gets into our lungs so we can breathe it out. They're going to focus on the alveoli, a lot on the MCAS. And we're going to see tomorrow some practice MCAS questions that have to do with the alveoli. Now looking at why diffusion happens. I'm going to give you 1 minute to write this down. All right, let's look at why oxygen moves into the blood and why carbon dioxide moves into the lung. We've just learned about diffusion. Remember, diffusion happens from high to low. Here's the word diffusion right here. It moves from where there's a lot of molecules to where there's a little bit of molecules. So, when we breathe in air, the majority of it is oxygen. So when we breathe it in the alveoli, we have a lot of oxygen here, and we don't have a lot of oxygen in the blood. So it's going to diffuse from where there's a lot to where there's a little bit. Carbon dioxide is also moving because of diffusion. There's a lot of carbon dioxide in your blood because that's a waste product that all of your cells make. And the carbon dioxide wants to move from where there's a lot to where there's a little bit. So it's going to move into the lungs and back out so it can be breathed out. So gas exchange in the alveoli, these tiny air sacs, is completely by diffusion. The circulatory system has to do with the blood vessels, and the heart. The circulatory system is closely related to the respiratory system because the circulatory system is what allows the oxygen and the carbon dioxide to move around the body. So the function of the circulatory system is to transport not only oxygen and carbon dioxide, but also to transport water, nutrients, and waste. It's going to be transporting these to and from cells around the body. So we're going to look at each of these. First, it transports nutrients from the digestive system. If you remember in the digestive system, the small intestine had those little finger-like projections called villi. And what happens is the nutrients get absorbed into the villi, and there's blood vessels in the villi, so it goes straight into the blood. Our blood is also going to be transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide to and from the lungs. Like we just saw, the capillaries are the blood vessels that surround the alveoli. The blood is also going to be transporting excess materials and waste to the excretory system. We're going to learn more about the excretory system later on this week. But the excretory system is how we excrete or get rid of wastes in our body. So without the blood to bring the waste to the liver and the bladder and places like that, we wouldn't be able to carry the waste out of our body. So there's three major parts of the circulatory system, and I've already mentioned these. The first being blood vessels. This is the route that blood travels. It doesn't just freely flow in your body, it's in vessels. We're going to look at the three types of blood vessels in a minute. The heart is the other major part of the circulatory system because the blood needs to be pushed around. So the heart is a pump that pushes blood throughout the body. And finally, blood itself, which is carrying the important stuff throughout our body, stuff being oxygen, food, and waste. So there are three types of blood vessels. They are arteries, capillaries, and veins, and they each carry blood a certain direction. The first is arteries. A for arteries, A for away. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. So this is carrying blood towards all of our organs and muscles that need it. Capillaries are the tiniest blood vessels. I always tell my freshmen, capillaries, think of tiny little caterpillars. They're the smallest blood vessels, and you can see them here. Here's an artery. Here are capillaries, which are the smallest, and it leads to a vein, our last type of blood vessel. So capillaries are connecting arteries and veins, and because they're so small, this is where diffusion can happen. This is the only place diffusion can happen because oxygen can finally get into the muscle cells and carbon dioxide can be picked up by the blood because it's small enough that it can fit through the walls of the capillaries. And finally, veins. Veins are going to now bring blood towards the heart. Okay. Usually we represent veins as blue, even though the blood is not blue. It doesn't have oxygen, okay? So there's no oxygen here. All of the oxygen was just used in my tissues, okay? So we represent it as blue, even though it's really not. It's just a darker red color, whereas in the arteries it's a very bright red. We're not going to go into too much detail about the heart, but the major thing that we need to know is that it has 4 chambers or compartments. There are upper chambers and there are bottom chambers. The upper chambers are called atrium. So there's a left atrium and a right atrium because there's a left side of the heart and a right side of the heart. The lower chambers are called ventricles. So there's a left ventricle and a right ventricle. The way I remember that the upper chambers are A and the lower chambers are V is that A comes before V in the alphabet. So here we have a picture of the heart. They may ask you how blood travels through the heart, but that requires a lot of memorization and we're not going to focus on that for the MCAS. But here you can see that it has 4 chambers. Here are the smaller upper atriums and the lower ventricles. Blood is the last portion of the circulatory system, and your blood is made up of different things. 1. Plasma. Plasma is the liquid portion of blood. This is the part that carries most of the nutrients, water, and waste. Red blood cells, which you can see on the right here. Red blood cells are responsible for carrying oxygen in our blood. They contain a special molecule called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is made up of iron, and basically what it does is it acts as a magnet for oxygen. So oxygen is carried in our red blood cells. The other parts of the blood are the white blood cells. This is a picture of a white blood cell. White blood cells fight and kill germs that may enter our bloodstream. So they're the defenders. They're part of our immune system that fights off diseases. And last but not least are platelets. Platelets are what form scabs when you cut yourself. So they're basically these tiny fragments of cells that are going to clump together and form a scab. So they are going to help stop bleeding. We're actually going to stop here for today and talk about the excretory system later on. Thanks for joining me.